I used to believe life unraveled slowly like a loose thread you only noticed once the sweater had already come apart. But the truth is, harsher sometimes. Life snaps in a single moment, leaving you gasping in the quiet that follows. I remember the exact second everything changed, the weight of divorce papers in my trembling hands, the snow tapping against the window of my lawyer's office, and the realization that after 28 years of marriage, I was being discarded like a broken ornament no longer worth dusting off. I had no idea then that the end of my world would lead me toward the beginning of another, or that a shivering stranger and my last $10 would rewrite my entire fate. I sat there in my attorney's office staring at Wade's signature bold and confident on the final page, while mine hovered blank as if refusing to agree to the destruction of the life I thought we shared. My lawyer's voice softened as he explained that Wade had been meticulous, almost surgical in his preparations. He said gently that everything was transferred legally and that accounts I once believed belonged to both of us had vanished into Wade's name months ago. I barely heard him as I watched snow slide down the window in pale streaks. At 52 years old, I was starting over with nothing but a suitcase of clothes and the bitter truth that my marriage had ended long before the ink touched the paper. The days that followed blurred like watercolor bleeding in rain. I packed my belongings from the house I'd spent nearly 3 decades turning into a home. Friends who once claimed loyalty became mysteriously busy, their unanswered calls echoing louder than words. When Wade arrived to collect his things, he stood in the doorway wearing clothes I'd never seen modern expensive, the kind Amber, his 26-year-old secretary, had probably chosen. He tried to explain himself, saying, "Rhonda, you have to understand," but I raised a hand and said quietly that I didn't need to understand anything at all. He gathered only his golf trophies and a few photo albums, leaving behind the wedding memories I once thought he cherished. As he left, he said, "You're stronger than you think," and for a moment I almost laughed at the absurdity of being encouraged by the man who'd just taken everything from me. When the house finally stood empty, I let the silence break me. My wedding ring, the last remaining symbol of a life that no longer existed, gleamed painfully against my skin. Selling it for $800 felt like selling evidence of a crime, but it was the only way to buy a train ticket to Denver, a city I'd never seen, but somehow believed might swallow my heartbreak quietly. At the station, clutching my last $10.73, I met the elderly man who changed everything. He sat shivering on a bench, his thin coat doing nothing against the storm. When he said softly that he'd misplaced his wallet and would be fine, something inside me cracked open. Maybe it was empathy. Maybe it was the instinct to save someone else because I couldn't save myself. But when I pressed that last $10 bill into his hand and said, "Please get something warm to eat," I never imagined that moment would ripple forward like destiny unfolding. I didn't know then that this simple act of kindness would return to me in ways I couldn't begin to imagine. Denver greeted me with knives of wind and a sky the color of wet concrete. When I stepped off the train, the cold went straight through my coat and into my bones, and any fragile fantasy I'd had about a fresh start vanished in the harsh air. I had no hotel reservation, no friends waiting for me, no plan beyond survival. Just a one-way ticket, a battered suitcase, and 73 cents rattling uselessly in my purse after buying that bottle of water and giving my last $10 to a stranger. Inside the station, warmth and noise wrapped around me like a temporary illusion. I stood near the entrance for a long time, watching families reunite, business people stride by with purpose, and couples holding hands as if the world outside couldn't touch them. None of them knew that a woman nearby had just traded nearly 3 decades of her life for a cot and a question mark. Eventually, I walked to the information desk and heard my own voice ask, "Excuse me, is there a homeless shelter nearby?" The clerk's eyes softened just a fraction as she told me it was about 8 blocks away and that I should hurry because they stopped intake at 9 p.m. The clock above us glowed with the quiet cruelty of time, and I nodded, gripping my suitcase as if it were an anchor in a storm. Those 8 blocks felt endless. Snow fell harder, clinging to my lashes and soaking my shoes. Every step was a reminder that this was real, that I was no longer a wife or a homeowner or a woman with a future neatly mapped out. I was one more soul trying to reach a door that promised warmth before it closed for the night. The Denver City Mission didn't look like much from the outside, but when I read the small sign that said, "All are welcome," something in my chest loosened. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant soup and exhaustion. A woman behind the desk, about my age with graying hair pulled back, asked, "First time," and I could only nod. She handed me forms, and I stared at the line that said, "Reason for homelessness," far longer than I should have, before writing one word, "divorce." They gave me a cot in a room full of women whose faces mirrored my own mixture of fear and fatigue. A young woman named Sarah helped me tuck in my sheets properly and whispered, "First night's the worst. Keep your valuables in your pillowcase and try not to take anything personally. Everyone's just trying to survive." On my other side, Margaret, with tired eyes and a gentle smile, murmured, "Lost my apartment when my disability check got messed up." Bureaucracy moves slow, but hunger moves fast. That night, I lay awake listening to soft sob snores and the rustle of restless bodies. I thought of the old man at the train station and wondered if he'd found warmth. In that room full of strangers, I had never felt so alone. Days blurred into a rhythm of oatmeal at 7 a.m., being out by 8 a.m., wandering the city in the cold, filling out job applications that needed an address I didn't have, and returning at dusk hoping there was still a bed left. The cruel cycle of needing a job to get housing and needing housing to get a job wrapped around me like a trap. Still, small bonds formed. Sarah shared stories of her dream to become a nurse. Margaret told me about the students she used to teach before illness changed everything. We were a fragile little island of hope in a sea of uncertainty. On my third night, as I was settling onto my cot and tucking my purse into my pillowcase like Sarah had taught me, raised voices drifted in from the lobby. I saw flashing red and blue lights dance across the dormitory ceiling, and my heart lurched, imagining police trouble chaos. A staff member opened the door and called out, "Is there a Rhonda Henderson here?" Every head turned. Sarah nudged me and whispered, "That's you, isn't it?" My legs felt like rubber as I stood and walked toward the lobby. Through the window, instead of squad cars, I saw something so out of place it looked like a hallucination. A sleek black limousine idling outside the shelter in the snow. A man in a tailored black suit stepped inside, brushing flakes from his shoulders. He scanned the room until his gaze locked onto mine. "Mrs. Henderson?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. When I nodded, he said, "My name is James Crawford. I'm here on behalf of someone you helped a few days ago, someone who would very much like to speak with you." My mind scrambled for context as I stammered that there must be a mistake, that I hadn't helped anyone, and then my own words caught in my throat. The train station. The old man, the $10 bill that had been everything. "It's about the gentleman at the station, isn't it?" I asked quietly. James smiled and warmth softened his features. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Hartwell has been quite anxious to find you." Behind me, Sarah murmured, "You don't have to go if you don't want to. Say the word, and we'll call the police." But something in James's eyes reminded me of the old man's quiet dignity, and I heard myself ask, "Will you bring me back if I need to return?" James nodded without hesitation and said, "If that's what you want. But I think you'll want to hear what he has to say first." Minutes later, I was sitting inside the limousine wrapped in warmth so deep it felt surreal. The leather seats were soft classical music played faintly, and the city outside blurred into streaks of light as we drove. I clutched my worn purse in my lap like a shield, my mind racing with questions. Who was this man, really? Why had he sent a limousine for a woman who'd slept on a shelter cot the night before? And what on earth could he possibly want from me? The car turned through iron gates and up a long, elegant driveway toward a stone mansion glowing warmly against the snow. As I stepped out, heart-pounding, the front door opened, and there he was, the same man from the train station, but transformed. Standing tall in a fine sweater and wool slacks, eyes bright instead of defeated, he smiled and said, "Rhonda, thank you for coming. My name is William Hartwell. Please come in. I owe you more than you can possibly imagine." The foyer of the mansion glowed with soft golden light, the marble floors reflecting the fire crackling somewhere deeper inside the house. I stepped in cautiously, my worn shoes squeaking against the polished stone, and for a moment I felt like an imposter wandering into someone else's dream. William guided me gently through the entryway, his presence warm despite the vastness around us. As we walked into a library lined floor to ceiling with books, he said softly that what you saw at the train station wasn't exactly who I am, and the gentle confession sent a ripple of uncertainty through me. He motioned for me to sit near the fireplace flames, illuminating the fine lines on his face lines carved from grief and time. When he said, "I need to explain the truth to you," I folded my hands in my lap and braced myself. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with the care of someone revisiting old wounds. He told me about his wife, Eleanor, a woman with kind eyes whose portrait hung above the mantel glowing in the firelight. He said they'd been married 43 years before she passed 8 months earlier, and as he described her compassion, her unwavering belief in the goodness of people, I could feel how deeply he'd loved her. His voice thickened when he admitted that after losing her, he'd grown bitter and disillusioned, convinced that everyone around him cared more about his money than the man he actually was. Then he told me the part that made my breath catch. For 3 weeks, he had wandered the streets dressed in old clothes, leaving his wealth behind so he could see how people truly treated him. "I became invisible," he said, staring into the fire. "No one spoke to me. No one saw me. I believed kindness had died." Then he looked at me, really looked, and the weight of that gaze pinned me in place as he said, "And then you sat beside me." I remembered the moment with startling clarity. The snow, the cold, the trembling hands of a stranger. I hadn't thought twice about offering him my last $10. I'd done it because something in his eyes reminded me of my father, proud, quiet, hurting. But to hear him say my kindness had saved him made my chest tighten until I felt breathless. "You gave me hope when I had none," he said softly. "You gave me a reason to live." For a long minute, I could only lower my gaze and let silent tears fall, overwhelmed by a truth I could barely grasp. I told him that I felt worthless lately, broken beyond repair, and he shook his head gently and said, "You matter more than you know." When he finally revealed why he'd brought me there, it felt like another world tilting beneath my feet. He explained that he ran a major charitable foundation, one his wife had started, and that it had been operating without the heart and personal connection she once brought to it. He told me he needed someone who understood compassion the way she did someone who knew what it meant to lose everything, yet still choose kindness. "I want you to help run it," he said, as if offering me something as delicate as glass. A salary of $75,000 a year, full benefits, and an apartment above the office. If you want it? My breath hitched. Me. A woman who'd slept in a shelter 2 nights ago, but something inside me, a spark long buried under years of diminishing self-worth, stirred awake. When I whispered, "I accept," William's entire face softened with relief. "Eleanor would have loved you," he murmured. I felt the truth of that settle in my heart like a blessing. That night, after he showed me the simple, warm apartment that would be mine, I stood in the doorway and felt the weight of a turning point. The woman who entered that mansion trembling with fear was not the same woman who stepped out hours later with a job, a home, and a purpose. 6 weeks later, I was fully immersed in the foundation's work helping women find housing, connecting families with food programs, feeling purpose flow through my days like oxygen. My confidence was returning in pieces. I began to walk differently, speak differently, believe differently, and just when the future felt finally blessedly stable, James appeared in my doorway one afternoon and said, "Mrs. Henderson, your ex-husband is here. He says he needs to speak with you." As I turned toward the waiting area and saw Wade sitting there, nervous, older worn, I felt something unfamiliar wash through me, Not fear, not longing, but clarity. Wade stood when he saw me smoothing the front of his suit as if trying to iron out the chaos underneath it. The man who once walked through life with unshakable confidence now shifted awkwardly his eyes, flicking around the polished reception area of the foundation as though he didn't quite believe I belonged there. When I stepped into my office and gestured for him to follow, he offered a stiff smile and said, "You look good, Rhonda," in the same tone he once used when trying to charm new clients. I simply replied, "Thank you. What do you want?" and watched his composure falter. He sat without being invited, glancing at my mahogany desk, my certificates on the wall, the quiet hum of purposeful life all around us. He cleared his throat before saying he'd seen my name in the newspaper, an article about the Foundation's new programs, and decided it was time we talked. I listened, arms folded, as he tried to soften his voice and say he'd been doing a lot of thinking, that he realized now what he'd thrown away. I didn't flinch even when he said, "Amber and it's over." His expression waited for a reaction, but I felt nothing but a distant, polite sympathy, the kind you feel when hearing about a stranger's misfortune. When I told him I had ended up in a homeless shelter, he jerked back as if struck. "A shelter, Rhonda? I had no idea," he insisted, but the words rang hollow. Of course he hadn't known. He'd never cared to look. He produced a folded settlement agreement from his jacket, offering me half of what he had left, and the moment he said the phrase, "what I have left," a quiet alarm sounded in my mind. It didn't take long for the truth to spill out: Amber's debts, the shopping sprees, the loans in his name, the facade of success that had been crumbling beneath him. I asked gently, "So now that she's drained, you dry, you want me back?" He swore that wasn't the case, but I watched the flicker in his eyes betray him. I stood needing distance, and he followed me with his gaze, desperation surfacing like a bruise. I told him I had changed, that I wasn't the woman who'd rearranged her entire life around his comfort. He tried to argue, to romanticize the past, to say we were good together. But when I asked him calmly, "Were we partners, Wade, or was I just the background noise to your life?" the question silenced him. When I asked him to leave, he hesitated before saying bitterly, "You've become cold. The woman I married would have forgiven me." I answered, "You're right, she would have, but I'm not her anymore," and watched him walk away with anger and confusion twisting together on his face. I believed that was the end of it. 3 days later, as snow drifted softly against the office windows, James appeared in my doorway again, his expression tight. "He's back," he said quietly, "and he's not doing well." I found Wade pacing the lobby, hair disheveled, gestures frantic, his voice cracking as he said he had nowhere to go. The house was gone. The accounts, empty foreclosure, finalized everything, unraveling faster than he could catch it. For the first time, I saw not the man who'd betrayed me, but a broken version of someone I once knew. I let him speak, let him say he needed help, let him say he needed me. But each plea landed with the heavy truth that he didn't want a partner, he wanted a lifeline. As he raised his voice in frustration, William stepped into the office, his calm presence filling the space like a steadying force. He greeted Wade politely, then listened as Wade tried to assert some claim over our history, his temper edging toward bitterness. When Wade demanded to know what she owes me after 28 years, William's voice became quiet and sharp as glass. He said, "She owes you nothing, not after what you did to her." When William revealed that he'd looked into Wade's financial collapse, the foreclosure, the debts, the bankruptcy filings, Wade turned pale. In that moment, his anger dissolved into something smaller, something closer to shame. I told him gently but firmly that I couldn't save him, that I wouldn't go back to someone who only remembered my worth after losing everything else. His shoulders sagged. He nodded, and for the first time in years, he left me without a final argument. As the door closed behind him, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was freeing. 1 year later, I found myself standing in the grand hall of the foundation during our annual benefit gala, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off crystal glasses and polished floors. A year earlier, I had walked into a shelter carrying a suitcase and a life in ruins. Now I walked through a crowd of donors, volunteers, and families whose lives we'd helped rebuild, wearing a navy dress I'd chosen myself, feeling a confidence that had once seemed impossible. The air buzzed with quiet joy as people chatted, bid on silent auction items, and embraced one another with gratitude for programs that had kept them afloat. I stood near the windows for a moment, watching snow drift outside, and felt a tenderness in my chest for the woman I used to be, the woman who'd been so convinced her story had ended that she couldn't see she was standing at the beginning. William joined me, looking elegant in his tuxedo, though his warm smile softened everything formal about him. He asked if I was nervous, and I shook my head with a small laugh, telling him I was excited instead. He looked at the crowded room and said quietly that Eleanor would have been proud, and the affection in his voice made something gentle settle between us. He didn't say it often, but I knew how deeply he still loved her, and I honored that love every time we worked side by side. Over the year, our companionship had grown into something steady and warm, not romance, not obligation, but a bond shaped by shared loss, shared purpose, and the simple choice to walk forward without pretending away the past. As the evening continued, success stories drifted around the room like small miracles. Maria, one of our program graduates, approached me with bright eyes and said she was starting her new job as a medical assistant on Monday. Sarah, the woman from the shelter who once slept in the cot beside mine, had completed nursing school and now mentored young women at the foundation. Margaret arrived wearing a black dress and holding the arm of her new husband, Robert, and told me with tears in her eyes that she finally had a home again. Each story felt like another brick laid in the structure of something meaningful, something bigger than the wounds that had once defined us. Later, when the crowd thinned and the orchestra packed away their instruments, William approached me with an envelope. "This came for you," he said, and when I saw my name on the front in familiar handwriting, my breath caught. Wade's letter was brief but sincere. He wrote that he'd spent the past year in treatment learning to face the emotional and financial recklessness that had destroyed our marriage. He said he'd found honest work as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit and was rebuilding from the ground up. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and he didn't ask to return. He wrote only that my refusal to rescue him had been the turning point he needed, that he hoped I was happy, that he was proud of who I had become. When I finished reading, I folded the letter slowly and felt something inside me settle a chapter, closing with grace rather than bitterness. William watched my face, gently asking if it was good news. I told him it was closure. He nodded, understanding in that quiet way of his, then hesitated before saying he had something important to discuss. His voice carried a trace of nervousness as he explained that the foundation had grown beyond what either of us could have imagined, and he wanted to expand into new cities. He said he needed someone who could guide the entire organization with compassion and vision. Then he asked if I would accept the role of Chief Executive Officer, $150,000 a year, full benefits and equity in the foundation's properties. My heart swelled with disbelief and gratitude, and when I asked why me, he answered that I understood what it meant to need help and what it took to rebuild, that I had turned my own story into a beacon for others, and that Eleanor herself would have chosen me. I accepted without hesitation, not because of the salary, not because of the title, but because the purpose in his eyes matched something now firmly rooted in my own heart. We talked quietly near the windows afterward, discussing expansion plans and travel schedules, and when he said that Eleanor believed angels walked the earth disguised as ordinary people, doing extraordinary things, I smiled and told him she was talking about all of us who chose kindness when we could choose selfishness. As the night wound down, I stepped outside into the softly falling snow. The flakes drifted gently around me, the street glowing beneath white lamplight, and I remembered the night I first stepped off that train with nothing but a suitcase and 73 cents. I had thought I was losing everything, But the truth was kinder. I was being stripped down to the core so I could rebuild into someone stronger, wiser, more compassionate than I had ever known myself to be. Sometimes life ends a chapter with a cruelty so sharp it feels like punishment, but often it is clearing space for a new story, one richer, deeper, and more honest than the one before it. Sometimes losing everything is how you finally find yourself. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic true stories. And tell me in the comments what moment in your life felt like an ending but turned out to be a beginning.